Welcome to a new video from Dreams with History. Tonight, we will delve into the extraordinary lives and astonishing fortitude of medieval peasants, those silent heroes of daily life who, defying a frequently adverse destiny, managed to survive some of the most frigid and merciless nights that history remembers. From ingenious insulation solutions devised with the scarce resources at their disposal, to communal practices for finding rest amidst the relentless cold, their story is a testament to courage, surprising inventiveness, and unbreakable resolve, a faint but persistent light in the darkness of the Middle Ages. So, before placidity completely envelops you, I invite you to pause for a moment and, if the narratives I share here resonate in your tranquility, to offer a gentle gesture of support with your like and subscription. Furthermore, I would love to know the point on the horizon from where you are joining us on this nocturnal journey and the time that marks your present. Your words in the comments are the compass that guides these stories for you. When the mind travels to the Middle Ages, it often evokes images of knightly tournaments, opulent banquets, and fairs brimming with joy. However, for the average peasant, the winter reality was far removed from this idyllic picture, focusing instead on the pressing question of how to survive the coming night. Winter was not merely a season, it represented a relentless test of endurance, returning each year with the severity of an inflexible master who offered no second chances. Your life unfolds in a modest hut of mud and wattle, its walls so thin that the slightest sneeze of a bird outside could echo within. The absence of insulation is total. Windows are an unknown luxury, unless you consider a small opening sealed with animal skin as such, and any trace of a thermostat is a fantasy. Despite occasional brotherly disputes, the temperature inside your dwelling usually exceeded the glacial cold reigning outside by only a few degrees. If the night unleashed a piercing cold, the interior offered, with an almost insulting scarcity, a marginally lesser relief, a cold irony. The night stood as the worst time of the day. Darkness devoured everything with voracity. The wind howled with the spectral fury of an enraged ghost, and the fire in the hearth, barely a pale dance of flames, sputtered with a pitiful weakness, striving in vain to warm the air, though its meagre heat hardly reached to roast the toes of one who dared to approach too closely. If you found yourself at the other end of the room, the rawness was palpable. You might as well have been camping in the open, with the added disadvantage of considerably less appetizing provisions. Clothing offered no significant comfort either. Peasants did not possess the sumptuous fur coats of the nobility, nor the fluffy goose-down comforters. Your humble wardrobe was limited to a couple of coarse wool tunics, perhaps a cloak with a vaguely goatish scent, and the faint hope that dressing in layers would transform you into a sort of human onion, multiplying your garments as if they were tunics. I anticipate the desolate outcome. It rarely worked. And forget the idea of snuggling under soft quilts. Beds, often, were no more than sacks coarsely stuffed with hay or straw, perhaps with some old reeds scattered on top as a sad concession, and as an additional gift, a persistent colony of fleas to offer you incessant company. Luxury. That was the ironic name for the existence of the medieval peasant. The cold was not merely a passing discomfort, it represented a latent and constant danger. Frostbite, hypothermia, and, in the worst-case scenario, freezing to death were omnipresent risks, especially for the most vulnerable, young children, and the elderly. Every dawn in which breath still fogged the air was considered a small miracle, a silent triumph that, honestly, deserved a modest celebration, perhaps with a slightly less frosted turnip for breakfast. So yes, surviving a medieval winter was not about seeking comfort, but about gritting your teeth with determination, wearing every scrap of fabric you owned, seeking the body heat of livestock in your humble abode, and praying fervently not to wake up with icicles hanging from your eyebrows. And the true odyssey of survival had just begun. Then there were the thatched roofs, a picturesque feature from a distance, but a constant source of tribulations up close. After a few months of incessant rain and heavy snowfall, the roofs sagged under the weight of moisture, dripped insistently, and, on occasion, offered an unexpected entrance to the local fauna. Nothing evoked a pleasant evening quite like the sudden appearance of a disoriented squirrel falling onto the meager dinner. The windows, if they existed at all, were ridiculously small, and generally covered with crudely tanned animal skins or rough wooden shutters. Glass was such a precious commodity that even the lord of the manor probably couldn't afford more than a small pane, and peasants considered themselves lucky if the relentless wind of a blizzard didn't rip away the cowhide sealing the opening in the wall. To make matters worse, the floors were often nothing more than packed earth. When the rains or snows were intense and prolonged, mud would seep up from the ground, so you could technically say your homes had indoor water features, although this peculiarity was not exactly appreciated. In winter, every step inside your own house could feel like a painful journey through a frozen swamp. Cold from below, cold from above, cold from within. It was a relentless, three-dimensional assault on body heat. But medieval peasants were not given to surrender or sterile complaints. With pragmatic tenacity, you plugged the cracks with damp moss, stuffed the worst drafts with old rags, and huddled together, resorting to human insulation in its most basic and essential form. Creativity born of necessity, an unbreakable stubbornness, and a thin layer of sheep fat rubbed on the walls were often the only barrier between you and transformation into grotesque medieval popsicles. Because if your own house was falling apart and the best defense against the elements involved hardened mud and goat hair, well, at least you could afford a bitter laugh, more or less, as long as the chattering of your teeth didn't drown out any attempt at humor. As if the biting air were not challenge enough, medieval peasants also had to face a silent enemy that rose from the depths, the frozen ground. The floors of that era barely deserved the name. They were simply extensions of slightly more level earth within the humble dwelling. Perhaps, with a bit of luck, someone had scattered some straw or aged reeds to offer an illusory sense of comfort. But make no mistake, your rest took place at an insulting distance from the hard, cold earth. And that cold, oh that cold, was relentless, seeping from the subsoil like a malevolent spectre, making its way through the flimsy layer of straw to reach your bones and seep directly into your soul. If an object fell to the ground during a winter night, it could be considered, without exaggeration, part of the medieval permafrost. If you have ever felt that your apartment suffers from drafts due to a window that doesn't close properly, let me assure you that medieval peasants would have much to discuss on the matter. Their homes did not just suffer from drafts. They were, in essence, particularly enthusiastic wind tunnels with a flimsy roof. Most peasant dwellings corresponded to what historians politely call wattle and daub constructions, a framework of interwoven rods like a giant basket coated with a peculiar mixture of mud, straw, and, yes, animal manure. This was not a porcine choice. The manure acted as a cheap and sticky insulator, in addition to being, let's say, always conveniently available. These walls, no matter how lovingly they were smeared, had little chance of withstanding a full-blown winter storm. The icy wind found every nook, every cranny, and cheerfully slipped into the single-room houses, swirling around and ensuring that comfort was an elusive commodity. Privacy? Absolutely none. Warmth? Barely a fantasy. Character development? Without a doubt. Medieval peasants tried to fight this grim battle in various ways. One method was to spread thick mats of straw on the floor. If fortune smiled, or more realistically, if you managed to steal enough from your neighbor's field without being discovered, you could get a decent insulating barrier. However, the straw flattened quickly, grew moldy even faster, and added a crunchy additional soundtrack to your already miserable nights. Some homes opted to place dry reeds on the earth. From time to time, they would throw fresh reeds on top, without bothering to remove the old ones. Over time, this created a fascinating ecosystem of decaying plants, fleas, and whatever mysterious creatures decided to settle there. It was basically a medieval version of carpet padding, with the distinction that the carpet was alive, slightly damp, and emitted a persistent aroma of wet dog. If humble medieval dwellings had a lone hero during the winter, it was not the roof, nor the walls, nor even the brave layers of earth and manure that tried to offer meagre insulation. It was the hearth, a crackling, stubborn fire pit that served as the only real defense against the penetrating cold, the omnipresent darkness, and the general melancholy that permeated medieval life. In the center of almost every peasant home burned an elemental fire, devoid of the elegance of a stone-mantled fireplace or a proper chimney to channel the smoke skyward. Instead, there was a rudimentary pit or a simple pile of stones, some half-burned logs, and enough smoke invading the room to make you question if you were slowly being turned into a smoked ham. That's right, most houses lacked even chimneys. The smoke simply did its best, escaping through small holes in the roof, cracks in the walls, or directly into your lungs if it was feeling particularly lazy that night. It wasn't ideal for breathing or for general life expectancy, but on the plus side, it did a commendable job of fumigating fleas and other unwanted guests. Who needed pest control when you were marinating in smoke 24 hours a day, 7 days a week? The hearth not only served to provide precarious warmth, it was also the kitchen, the main source of light, and, on occasion, even the rudimentary medieval version of a television. People gathered around the fire, telling orally transmitted stories, sharing gossip, or simply contemplating the dancing flames because, frankly, there wasn't much else to do after sunset. Keeping the fire alive was not just a good idea, it was an imperative necessity. Letting the flame die out during the night was like putting up a sign inviting the cold to come in and finish you off. Besides, rekindling a fire in the middle of winter was not as simple as striking a modern match. It required working with flint, steel, tinder, and more prayers than had ever been offered. Each family member had an assigned duty, gently stoking the flames, watching the glowing embers, adding peat, dry branches, or, if luck smiled, a precious piece of dry wood. It was a constant battle between human persistence and the suffocating cold that wanted nothing more than to extinguish life. The hearth did not guarantee survival, but without it, survival was frankly a fantasy. It was a small, smoky fire, often disappointing in its meager heat, but in the context of a medieval winter, it represented the pulsating heart of hope, if any remained. The beds, for those fortunate enough to own one, offered no significant solution to the penetrating cold. They were generally little more than rudimentary wooden frames filled with, you guessed it, more straw or hay. Instead of the plush mattresses we are accustomed to, you encountered prickly, shifting, and crunchy layers that did little against the relentless cold radiating from the frozen ground. Tossing and turning in bed was not an attempt to find comfort, but a desperate and clumsy dance to keep the blood circulating and prevent one side of your body from freezing completely. The truth is, medieval peasants did not conquer the frozen ground so much as they learned to live uncomfortably on top of it. A restful night's sleep was not about pleasant dreams or enveloping softness, but simply about waking up with all your toes still attached to your body. And if you achieved that modest victory, well, you could say you were better off than most. If there was one thing medieval peasants feared more than a shortage of ale, it was the hearth fire going out during the night. Without that warm, flickering umbilical cord, the cold would sneak into your humble dwellings with a speed even greater than that of a tax collector after the harvest. And in the heart of winter, restarting a fire from scratch was not a mere inconvenience. It could have fatal consequences. Matches were a future invention, lighters a distant dream. Rekindling the flame meant striking flint and steel with precision, begging for a single precious spark, and then nurturing that faint glow with tender care and the dry tinder you had managed to preserve from previous days. Imagine the task of carrying all this out in the frigid darkness, with your body still numb from sleep and your fingers numb from the cold. Add, for a touch of extra motivation, the hungry howl of a wolf echoing in the distance. Faced with this situation, the peasants developed a clever strategy. They didn't extinguish the fire, but rather deposited it in a sort of heat savings account. Banking the fire meant carefully burying the glowing embers under a protective mound of ash just before retiring for the night. The ash acted as an insulating blanket, preserving the barely living ember until dawn. If the technique was applied correctly, as dawn approached, it was enough to gently stir the pile, add fresh wood, and voila, the fire was reborn without the need to face the frigid task of starting it from scratch. However, a mistake in this delicate process could mean a much colder and considerably grumpier awakening. The art of banking the fire was passed down from generation to generation, like a cherished family recipe. Each household guarded its little secrets. Some swore by completely dry ash, while others insisted that a slight degree of moisture was the key. Some packed the embers firmly, others let them breathe. You could practically start a medieval dispute just by suggesting a superior method for preserving the fire. It was the ancestral version of heated arguments over barbecue techniques, only with slightly higher survival stakes. However, sometimes merely preserving the fire was not enough. A howling wind could sneak through an unexpected crack and mercilessly extinguish it, or a particularly clumsy sheep could trip over the hearth. Yes, it happened, which is why some families established shifts to get up during the night and check on the embers, the medieval equivalent of sleepwalking to the thermostat. Ultimately, preserving the fire was less about mastering the forces of nature and more about gaining a few precious hours of warmth. And if you woke up with even a single surviving ember, that was a victory sufficient to face another day of struggle against the relentless cold. In the Middle Ages, The maxim "the more the merrier" transcended festive celebrations, establishing itself as a crucial winter survival tactic. When the fire sputtered weakly and the icy winds whistled threateningly through every crack, there was one reliable source of heat: human proximity. And if this meant sleeping cheek to jowl with the entire family, the neighbours, the livestock, and possibly a particularly disoriented goose, so be it. Personal space was an unknown luxury. Privacy didn't even exist as a concept on the coldest nights. The primary goal was not comfort, but avoiding waking up frozen to the floor. Entire households would pile into the warmest corner of the house, wrapped in as many scraps of cloth as they could find, forming what could be described as a desperate, snoring human lasagna. The youngest children would nestle between parents and grandparents, seeking refuge under the outer layers, and if Cousin Ethel showed up unexpectedly, well, there was always room for one more. With luck, you slept in the middle, where body heat radiated from all directions. With bad luck, you were on the edge, the medieval equivalent of sleeping next to the door of a walk-in freezer, and woe to anyone who dared move too much during the night. A simple turn to find a more comfortable position could result in pushing Aunt Moret into the icy draft by the wall. Congratulations, you instantly became the family villain. Sometimes, even bedding was shared, a communal straw mattress that slowly flattened under the nightly weight of multiple generations. And since hygiene wasn't exactly a priority at that time, let's just say it wasn't the most fragrant sleeping arrangement. But hey, when the alternative is freezing to death, you stop being picky. Body heat wasn't just pleasant, it was strategic. Some medieval guides even deliberately recommended placing the strongest, warmest people on the outside of the group as human shields against the penetrating cold. Babies and frail elders were huddled in the center, treated like the small, precious heat generators they were. However, this wasn't just about survival. Over time, it became an intrinsic part of daily life, another element of the family bond. The long winter nights huddled together led to the telling of orally transmitted stories, the singing of ancestral melodies, and undoubtedly, some very interesting conversations muffled under a shared wool blanket. So the next time your brother steals the blanket or your dog hogs the bed, remember that at least you're not fighting for space between a snoring uncle and a particularly judgmental goat. If you thought modern roommates were a challenge, medieval peasants would introduce you to their winter hunting companions: cows, goats, pigs, chickens, basically any creature with a pulse and a minimal emission of body heat. Bringing animals inside the humble dwelling was not a mere quaint village tradition, but a vital necessity for survival. Livestock generated heat, and in a poorly insulated hut where the wind howled louder than your own stomach, every little degree counted. Besides, if a goat shared a wall with you, it was slightly less likely that a neighbor would steal it in the middle of the night. Two birds with one smelly stone. As night fell, the house transformed into a chaotic, living furnace. Chickens nested in dark corners, pigs grunted near the precarious hearth, and cows lay luxuriously against the walls, chewing their cud with the deliberation of someone paying rent. It was not glamorous, not by a long shot. If you've ever been stuck in a car on a summer road trip with someone who forgot to shower, imagine that situation, but your companion is a cow. The season is winter, and there is literally nowhere else to go. The smells were legendary. By spring, the perfume of a shared winter was something fierce. You didn't need to light a candle. Your nostrils were already on a wild olfactory journey. But medieval peasants developed a selective nose. You didn't complain too much because you knew an uncomfortable truth. The more animals inside, the fewer frozen toes upon waking. Certain animals even enjoyed privileged locations. Cows, being the largest and warmest, generally took center stage near the family. Goats were allowed closer for their heat, and because goats, being goats, would find a way in anyway. Chickens perched on the ceiling beams or in old baskets. And the pigs, well, the pigs didn't care. They flopped down wherever they pleased, probably right in the middle of the floor. Of course, sharing a bedroom with livestock was not without its dangers. Imagine falling peacefully asleep, only to be rudely awakened by a chicken deciding your hair is an ideal perch, or stepping on something suspicious first thing in the morning while walking barefoot. Yes, medieval mornings could be full of surprises. Still, despite the noise, the smells, and the occasional hoof in the ribs, the peasants understood the simple math: cold kills, and cows cuddle, whether they want to or not. In the battle against the icy fingers of winter, a warm, slightly slobbery cow's breath was often the deciding factor between life and death. In medieval winters, Fashion wasn't about aesthetics, but about pure, unadulterated survival. Peasants didn't browse the latest trends. You dressed in layers as if preparing for a pitched battle against the Grim Reaper himself. The rule was simple. If you owned it, you wore it, sometimes all at once. First, the basic inner tunic, a rough and probably not very clean linen shirt. Over that, a thicker wool tunic. Then another, if fortune allowed. You added some coarse leggings that were pulled up around your knees, a rough cloak over your shoulders, and, if luck was particularly generous, a patched sheepskin thrown on top like a prized trophy. Congratulations! You were now approximately 10% warmer and 90% more prone to itching. Boots were a luxury. Many peasants wrapped their feet in layers of cloth or old rags and stuffed them into wooden clogs. If the cold still bit fiercely, well, you just added another rag and hoped not to lose a toe in the process. And forget the idea of washing all those layers. Washing clothes in the middle of winter meant dragging them to a frozen stream, breaking through the layer of ice, and then waiting 2 days for your only shirt to dry. If it didn't freeze solid in a tragic ice shirt cycle. Most peasants, with wise resignation, decided that smelling like a peculiar mix of smoke, sweat, and sheep was a small price to pay to avoid total frostbite. Interestingly, the accumulation of dirt and grease offered an unexpected additional feature: insulation. That greasy layer trapped body heat. It was like a medieval Gore-Tex jacket, only considerably smellier and much less socially acceptable today. Hats, scarves, and gloves were coveted treasures. A simple wool cap could mean the difference between surviving the night or waking up with your hair frozen to the wall. Gloves were often homemade, crafted from scraps of leather or fabric that people could get their hands on, sometimes looking more like sad puppet costumes than functional garments. Children were especially bundled up until they looked like overstuffed turnips, waddling awkwardly around the house. The primary goal was to trap as much body heat as possible. Style, elegance, these were unknown concepts. Warmth was the true medieval luxury. So the next time you complain about having to dress in layers for a cold day, remember the medieval peasants walking around with half their wardrobe on their backs, looking like bulging laundry bags, and considering themselves lucky for it. In the unspoken manual of the medieval peasant, dirt transcended mere lack of hygiene. It stood practically as a survival tool. It turns out that ingrained grime was not a sign of slovenliness, but a tactic, a strategy, dare we say, an inadvertent stroke of genius. Winter posed a very specific challenge: the loss of body heat. Clean clothes, especially freshly washed linen, proved surprisingly ineffective at retaining warmth. It was breathable, yes, but when the ambient temperature flirted dangerously with hypothermia and instant regret, breathability was not exactly your best attribute. This is where dirt came into play. As peasants labored day after day without washing their garments, layers of grime, natural body oils, and ancestral mud began to accumulate on their tunics, cloaks, and leggings. Over time, this natural armor clogged the tiny interstices of the fabric, making the clothing more resistant to the icy wind. It was a sort of medieval waterproofing, albeit with a considerably less pleasant aroma. Certainly, you might emit a fragrance similar to that of a goat who had lost a bet. But guess what? Your body heat was better preserved. In fact, some medieval beliefs held that washing too frequently during the winter could predispose one to illness. It was preferable to keep that protective barrier of holy grime intact. Bathing was a rarity, laundry even more so, and soap, when it existed, was reserved for solemn occasions, like a visit from the bishop, or perhaps just before breathing your last. To complete this survival strategy, peasants dressed in layers without removing the lower ones. You simply added a new garment on top of the previous week's. Eventually, you became a walking museum of the last 6 weeks, each stain telling the heroic story of that time. You slipped in the mud but managed to avoid a premature death. To outside observers, medieval peasants might have looked and smelled as if they had completely given up on standards of hygiene, but they knew the truth. That grimy, crusty tunic was a thermal shield against lethal frostbite. It wasn't glamorous, but neither was freezing to death for aspiring to smell like flowers. Besides, in a world where literally everything stank to high heaven, you weren't offending anyone. Olfactory adaptation was practically a way of life. So yes, in medieval winters, dirt wasn't a failure. It was functional fashion. And if you were sporting a thick, greasy outer layer by February, my friend, you were winning at life. If you ever imagined medieval peasants spending their winters snuggled in fluffy feather beds under embroidered quilts, reconsider that image. The reality was considerably more rustic. And by rustic, I mean, let's sleep on a pile of dead plants and hope for the best. Beds in the world of the medieval peasant usually consisted of a rough wooden frame, if finances allowed, covered with a bulky sack stuffed with straw, hay, or aged reeds. That was it. No memory foam, no orthopedic support, no five-star hotel experience. Just a crunchy, lumpy, and slightly prickly jumble that emitted a vague scent of barnyard and regret. Each nocturnal movement brought with it a delightful soundtrack of rustling straw and the occasional sharp poke from a rebellious stalk. Some peasants even did away with the wooden frame and simply scattered the straw directly on the dirt floor, creating a luxurious ground-level sleeping experience that modern influencers would probably rebrand as earth-connected sleeping. Straw mattresses were not only uncomfortable but also ephemeral. Over time, the straw would flatten, get mouldy, attract insects, and generally turn into a biological hazard zone. Changing the straw was a significant event, usually carried out a couple of times a year if you were diligent, or when the bed began to actively move without the sleeper's permission. Reeds offered a popular alternative. These long grasses were spread in a thick layer on the floor, sometimes mixed with aromatic herbs like lavender or rosemary to mask the omnipresent livestock aroma of daily life. Fresh reeds gave off a lovely fragrance for about a day. Afterward, they became part of the muddy, trampled landscape inside the house, blending seamlessly with the dirt, food scraps, and anything else that came in. And let's not forget the bedfellows. Fleas, lice, and other charming creatures loved straw bedding almost as much as the peasants themselves. If you woke up scratching more than you had slept, congratulations. You were living the authentic medieval experience. Despite the hardships, these humble beds were a lifesaver. The piles of straw provided a crucial insulating layer against the frozen earth, and huddling on them created pockets of shared body heat, medieval central heating at its finest. So, the next time you sink into your soft, ergonomically supportive mattress, remember that somewhere in history, a medieval peasant is watching you from above, smiling through a toothless mouth and muttering, "That must be nice." When you live in a dwelling built with sticks, mud, and a dose of optimism, you quickly learn that winter breezes are not just an annoyance, but direct personal attacks. Medieval peasants not only fought the cold coming from outside, but they also battled it from inside their own homes, armed only with what they could stuff into the countless cracks. The walls warped over time, the mud crumbled, leaving gaps, the roof thatch settled, revealing new openings. The cold seemed to find new crevices to slip through each night like a mischievous poltergeist with a persistent thirst for thermal vengeance. Sealing the house became a rudimentary art form. Peasants stuffed the gaps with damp moss, bits of loose straw, scraps of old cloth, bundles of dry grass, and sometimes even animal hair. If it was soft, fluffy, or vaguely insulating, it was jammed into any available hole. Some particularly determined souls would smear additional layers of mud and manure on the outside of their walls as an annual winter project. Imagine the scene, in freezing weather, slapping cold manure against your own house while muttering, "This is fine, this is luxury," because in a way, it was. Leaky roofs represented another constant battlefront. Thatch, though cheap and abundant, was not exactly waterproof, especially after several seasons of rain and snow. Peasants plugged the holes in the roof with spare pieces of cloth, bundles of reeds, or, in moments of true desperation, chunks of turf stolen from the nearest field. Each house, over time, began to resemble a slightly sad patchwork quilt made by someone who gave up halfway through. Doors and windows, if you were fortunate enough to have them, were a mixed blessing. Even then, they were little more than rough-hewn wooden planks held together with iron nails and a good dose of stubbornness. Window gaps were often covered with animal skins or thick cloth soaked in animal fat to block the worst drafts and add an additional aroma of mystery meat to the living space. Each night was a contest between human ingenuity and the relentless, slippery cold. One moment, you might feel relatively warm. The next, a sudden gust would find the one neglected spot, hitting and waking you like a frigid hand of fate. Yet somehow, through practical intelligence, unwavering obstinacy, and a refusal to accept slightly frozen as a permanent state, medieval peasants patched, stuffed, and smeared their way through the worst winters nature could unleash, one handful of mud at a time. When the cold bites with enough intensity to keep you awake at night, medieval peasants had a pragmatic solution. Don't even try to pretend everyone is sleeping simultaneously. Instead, They developed a survival strategy that would make any military commander proud today: sleeping in shifts. It wasn't an elaborate system with whistles and attendance lists, but something much simpler and more desperate. Half the house would stay awake, tending the precarious fire and plugging the icy drafts, while the other half huddled under threadbare blankets and hay, trying to catch a few precious hours of semi-frozen sleep. The fire required constant attention. If left unattended, it would die out. And rekindling it, remember, was a task about as simple as making a stubborn donkey dance. By February, if you accidentally inhaled a deep breath of icy air, you could congratulate yourself on acquiring a first-class ticket to a week of coughing up fragments of what felt like your soul, with no doctors in sight, and your grandmother offering a remedy of hot onion broth and firm prayers. Some people even tucked parts of their cloaks, shawls, or rags over their faces while they slept, creating a makeshift barrier to warm their exhaled breath. Of course, this also meant waking up with a damp, slightly soaked patch of cloth stuck to your mouth. But hey, it was preferable to freezing from the inside out. Children were taught these tricks from an early age. Parents would scold the little ones for panting like dogs inside the house during the cold months. And honestly, between the strict breathing lessons, the itchy wool layers, and sleeping next to an aggressively flatulent goat, medieval childhood winters built character on a whole different level. At night, huddled on straw beds, under piles of cloaks, and next to a gently steaming cow, breathing became an art form. Slow, steady, only through the nose, and as shallowly as possible. A grim medieval version of a yoga retreat, only with more risk of frostbite and fewer inspirational quotes in the Great Survival Manual. It wasn't the flashiest strategy, but it worked. One shallow breath at a time, the peasants endured another night in the long, relentless war against winter. In the endless contest against the medieval winter, peasants discovered an unexpected secret weapon: a full stomach. It turns out that one of the best ways to fight the cold wasn't another layer of scratchy wool, but to stuff yourself with something substantial and heavy just before retiring for the night. Calories meant heat. The more your body had to digest, the more heat it generated in the process. It was basic medieval thermodynamics. Ingest a hearty meal, generate internal heat, and maybe, just maybe, survive until morning without becoming a peasant-shaped popsicle. So, what did medieval people pile on their plates before a long, frigid night? Think thick stews, packed with root vegetables like turnips, onions, and parsnips. Grains were also a lifesaver: oats, barley, or dense, chewy rye bread. If luck was particularly generous, say after a feast day or a bountiful slaughter, you might even get a piece of salt pork or a slice of dried sausage in the pot. This wasn't comfort food in the modern sense. No delicate presentation, no artisanal garnishes. It was a huge, vaguely brown-colored meal designed to sit in your stomach like a friendly brick, burning slowly through the night and keeping your body slightly warmer. It wasn't just about eating a lot, but about eating smart foods that took longer to digest and provided a slow, steady trickle of heat. Fatty foods were particularly praised, not only for the energy they provided, but because fat burns more slowly than lean meat. A belly full of stew, bread, and a questionable amount of lard was the ultimate medieval winter luxury. Parents, with iron determination, ensured that even the pickiest children consumed hearty portions. No one cared if little Thomas found turnips repulsive. The order was clear: you ate your turnips, or you shivered all night, regretting their absence. A stern but effective pedagogy, genuine medieval style. Of course, a heavy evening intake had its own drawbacks. While your body might generate more internal heat, you also ran the risk of a night plagued by vivid, strange dreams, fueled by a stomach working hard to process the equivalent of an entire cabbage patch. Was it worth the sacrifice? Absolutely. Because, ultimately, peasants weren't looking for a Michelin-starred gastronomic experience, but for mere survival. And if that meant retiring to bed with a full bloated belly, breathing softly through your nose next to a steaming cow, well, that was just another night in the relentless quest to witness a new, frigid dawn. Long before the invention of electric blankets and sophisticated heated mattress pads, medieval peasants had to rely on their ingenuity if they yearned for an extra dose of warmth at bedtime. Thus, the humble haybox and the ever-reliable hot stone emerged as the unsung heroes of relentless winters. Let's start with the haybox. Its name evokes rusticity, and it certainly was, but the underlying idea was one of pristine genius. Peasants would take a sturdy wooden box, line it generously with dry hay, and use it to keep previously cooked food warm for hours. Leftover stew, hot oatmeal. You'd place the delicacy in the hay box, cover it carefully, and it would stay warm enough for a midnight snack without the need to risk rekindling the fire. They were, in essence, the medieval slow cookers. But peasant ingenuity didn't stop at food. They soon realized that if hay could trap the heat of a pot of stew, it could also retain the heat of something even more comforting: rocks. Thus began the era of the hot stone. Before retiring for the night, someone, probably the unfortunate child who had lost the latest family dispute, would take a flat stone and toss it into the heart of the hearth fire. After roasting it until it was dangerously hot to the touch, a fine line between useful and a third-degree burn, it was extracted with a stick or some rusty tongs. The stone, still radiating a blessed warmth, was carefully wrapped in old rags, tucked into a piece of worn cloth, or placed in a clay pot, and then slid under the hay of the mattress or at the foot of the bed. A rudimentary medieval heating pad, ready to combat the frigid emanation from the earth. Of course, there were inherent risks. If the stone wasn't wrapped properly, you could find yourself with a small, localized fire inside your home. And if it accidentally fell on a bare foot, well, let's just say that winter injuries weren't always the result of slipping on ice. But when everything went as planned, that stone provided a precious, comforting warmth that could last for hours. It wasn't an ostentatious luxury, but when your existence unfolded in a semi-frozen hut, luxury was simply defined as not waking up with icicles hanging from your nose. In the vast arsenal of medieval winter survival, a hot rock wrapped in hay might not sound glamorous, but for the peasants clinging to any glimmer of warmth, it was a small, daily miracle. In the humble home of a medieval peasant, the fire was not merely the place where dinner was prepared. It was practically another member of the family, a member that was certainly temperamental, smoky, and sometimes uncooperative, but absolutely essential for survival, especially when it came time to seek rest. The closer you slept to the fire, the greater the chances of waking up unfrozen. This meant that sleeping arrangements were based less on personal preferences and more on strategic positioning for thermal survival. Babies, the elderly, and anyone afflicted by illness or frailty had priority for the warmest spots. Parents, older children, and the most robust adults were distributed from there, acting as additional layers of human insulation. Being assigned a spot near the fire was not just an act of kindness, but a simple equation of survival. Babies were delicate heat generators, and the elderly were precious repositories of family knowledge and, let's be honest, the best village gossip. Protecting them with the most intense heat was an undeniable necessity, but it wasn't all about pleasantly toasting by the flames. Too close, and you risked waking up with scorched hair or a suspiciously smouldering cloak. Too far, and you were basically camping in a makeshift refrigerator. It was a delicate dance, staying close enough to enjoy the fire's glow, but not so close as to have to explain to your neighbour why you now resembled a half-cooked roast. The fire also didn't radiate heat evenly. It primarily roasted the people directly in front of it, while everyone else fought for the narrow cone of warmth like cold lizards vying for a ray of sunshine. If fortune smiled and you fell asleep facing the fire, you could enjoy one blissfully warm side and another so frozen you could probably carve ice with it. Pets and livestock, of course, also sought their place near the heat. A dog might curl up between you and the fire, its tail wagging dangerously close to the open flame. Chickens sometimes perched precariously on the hearthstones, clucking softly through the night like little feathered guardians of the heat. Every crackle of the logs, every shift of the glowing embers, was a small promise. You're still alive. You're still warm, for now. And so, the peasants surrendered to a restless sleep, lulled by the pops and hisses of the fire, each exhalation forming small clouds in the frigid air that stretched beyond the fragile circle of warmth. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't comfortable, but it was life itself, clinging to warmth by a thread of glowing embers. In the medieval world, no one survived the winter alone, unless they aspired to become a particularly elegant frozen statue by January. Survival wasn't just a family affair, but a community project, a messy, muddy and noisy collaboration where the warmth and life of each individual intrinsically depended on the others. Peasants knew that in the dead of winter, a robust fire and a pile of hay could only offer limited protection. If a neighbour's house went dark, it was noticed. If the smoke from old Tom's hearth suddenly stopped rising into the sky, someone went to check on his well-being. And not just because Tom owed a chicken, though that might have been a factor, but because community was synonymous with survival. Villages had unofficial winter watchmen, Often the young or the elderly, who couldn't work the fields but could observe who was coughing too frequently, who hadn't been to the market in days, or whose house remained suspiciously still under the morning frost. These people were the medieval version of the neighbourhood watch, minus the reflective vests, and with more sheep nearby. If a family's fire went out, it was considered almost an emergency. A good neighbour would rush over with a glowing ember wrapped in rags, or better yet, invite them into their own smoky, crowded hut for the night. Yes, it meant cramming 4 more bodies into an already tight space, but it was preferable to finding frozen friends in the spring. Communal food reserves also played a crucial role. During particularly brutal winters, villages sometimes shared their last provisions of salted meat, grain, and dried vegetables. It was a somber charity. No one had abundance, but a few shared meals could mean the difference between stumbling into spring or not living to see it. Even children understood the gravity of the situation. They helped carry firewood, shared embers, and ran urgent messages when someone needed help. No one was too small or too tired when winter tightened its icy grip. Certainly, medieval villages were not an Eden of constant harmony. Disputes arose. Fights over land, goats, or a good borrowed cooking pot never completely disappeared. But when the nights turned deadly cold, old grudges were often quietly set aside. After all, survival remained the primary goal, because tomorrow, you yourself might be the one needing rescue. In the frozen heart of winter, the village transformed into one large, stubborn family, sometimes dysfunctional, often hilarious, but always fiercely determined to survive together. One muddy boot, one crackling ember, and one frozen smile at a time. When the cold bit with enough intensity to keep medieval peasants awake at night, they didn't just put on more layers of clothing or stoke the fire with renewed vigour. They also raised their prayers with fervour. Because when the wind howled like a pack of hungry wolves against their flimsy walls, and the fire shrank to a bed of sombre embers, you wanted to have every possible advantage, including a little divine intervention. Faith was not merely a Sunday ritual in that era. It was intrinsically intertwined with every icy breath. Before sliding under the layers of scratchy straw and coarse wool, families would kneel together, offering hurried prayers that the fire would not go out, the roof would remain intact, and their toes would still be attached upon waking. The saints transcended their role as distant holy figures, becoming the first line of defense against the onslaught of winter. Saint Blaise, for example, was invoked to protect against throat ailments, a not insignificant concern when a simple gulp of frigid air could provoke a soul-shaking cough. St. Nicholas was not just the cheerful gift-giver of later legend. He was also asked to protect homes from sudden ruin during the lean and deadly months. Superstitions were comfortably interwoven with daily survival. Some families would sprinkle a little holy water near the hearth before bed, hoping it would act as a shield against evil spirits or, at the very least, against mischievous draughts. Others marked their doors with blessed chalk after certain feast days, imploring that warmth and good fortune would find their way inside. Candles also played a significant role. Special votive candles, blessed by the local priest or the most pious old woman in the village, were often kept lit throughout the night, a flickering plea against the cold darkness that clawed at the walls. And, of course, no serious winter prayer session was complete without some solemn promises. Dear Lord, if you just let us get through this night, I swear I'll be nicer to my neighbour, even the one who insists on stealing our turnips. Faith was not an abstract comfort, but a daily, urgent conversation. The peasants didn't ask for earthly luxuries, only for basic survival. A little warmth, some food, and one more day to keep going until spring broke its icy dominion over their small villages. It was a simple, raw hope, whispered between the smoky beams, entangled in breathless prayers, and huddled under rough blankets that somehow sustained them through the endless, relentless winter nights. Despite all the ingenuity displayed, the fervent prayers offered, and the unbreakable obstinacy with which medieval peasants faced the winter, a chilling truth persisted. Sometimes their efforts were not enough. And when winter triumphed, it not only claimed the lives of a few unfortunate souls, but it took with it entire families, whole villages, fading them into the sepulchral silence under a heavy shroud of snow and ice. Some winters raged with a particular cruelty, like the infamous winter of the Great Famine of 1315, when torrential rains annihilated the crops, livestock perished from starvation, and freezing temperatures transformed an already brutal existence into a slow, agonizing catastrophe. The desperation was such that people whispered tales of consuming shoe leather, tree bark, and, in the most horrific cases, the bodies of their fellow humans. Not keeping the hearth fire alive was not a mere inconvenience. It often amounted to a death sentence. Without the meagre warmth of the flame, families would huddle together one last time. Neighbours, upon the arrival of spring, would sometimes discover entire households, bodies still intertwined in a frozen embrace, as if trying to share one last vestige of warmth until the very end. The dwellings themselves could collapse under the weight of accumulated snow or the lashing of ice storms. A roof caving in during the middle of a frigid night was not only catastrophic but often fatal. Dragging yourself through thigh-deep snow to beg for shelter from neighbours offered no guarantees either, especially if those neighbours were already at the limit of their resources. Disease also flourished in the cold. Starvation weakened the body, and the cramped, smoky houses became breeding grounds for pneumonia, bronchitis, and other lethal infections. A simple cough in December could easily foreshadow a funeral in January, and then there was the silent horror of frostbite. Fingers, toes, even ears would blacken and die while still attached to their owners. Some villagers survived the winters at the cost of their limbs, a grim badge of honor that proclaimed, "I made it, but winter took a piece of me." However, the most unsettling thing was not just death itself, but the eerie normality with which its presence was accepted. People assumed that with each winter, some of them would not live to see the thaw. Death was not an unexpected event, but simply another neighbour knocking at the door, cloaked in frost, awaiting his turn. Even amidst the bitter cold and constant threat, medieval peasants persisted, stubborn, grieving, clinging to life with tenacity, because as long as one glowing ember remained in the hearth, one visible breath in the icy air, there was still a fight worth fighting. When we remember the medieval peasants, those muddy, shivering survivors of endless winters, it is tempting to focus solely on their hardships, the chapped hands, the frozen toes, the smoky huts. But buried beneath all that palpable struggle lies something much more powerful, a legacy of rudimentary ingenuity and an unbreakable stubbornness. They did not have central heating, high-tech insulated jackets, or comfortable memory foam mattresses. They didn't even have the luxury of assuming they would survive until spring. But what they did possess, and what they bequeathed to posterity, was a model of resilience in the face of adversity. Every makeshift hay mattress, every manually stoked fire, every crack in the wall sealed with moss, was an eloquent testament to human creativity under extreme pressure. Faced with seemingly impossible odds, they did not collapse into despair. They adapted. They learned from the land that sustained them, from the shared wisdom of their peers, and from the bitter lessons etched by each brutal winter. Their communities were built on more than just the possession of common lands. They were built on shared survival. They taught each other the art of caring for the sick, of pooling scarce resources when food was low, of trusting that helping a shivering neighbour today meant someone might extend a hand tomorrow. They lived under the unspoken understanding that no one beats winter alone. Their faith also represented a form of resistance. They wove prayers into the fabric of their daily lives, not just out of fear, but also out of a tenacious, fragile hope that the next day might be a little warmer, a little brighter. The hope that, after 100 dark nights, spring would inevitably return, and life would find a way to sprout through the frozen ground. And somehow it did, thanks to their silent sacrifices, thanks to their modest but crucial victories in surviving one more night, one more storm. Future generations prospered, slowly but surely, freeze after freeze, propelling humanity forward, enduring winters that their ancestors barely managed to overcome, until warmth and comfort became common expectations instead of distant dreams. Their blood, their sweat, and their ingenuity are invisibly woven into the lives we enjoy today. Every cozy blanket, every warm home, every leisurely winter evening sipping tea under soft lights. It is all the end result of countless medieval peasants who refused to yield to the relentless cold. So the next time the wind howls ominously outside your double-paned window, perhaps spare a thought for them. The anonymous and intrepid, who transformed trembling survival into a living legacy. One glowing ember, one visible breath, one stubborn heartbeat at a time. Anne Boleyn did not come into this world girded by a crown or escorted by armies. Born around 1501, with the English countryside of Blickling Hall or the imposing Hever Castle as possible birthplaces, she was the fruit of the union between Thomas Boleyn, a diplomat of palpable ambitions, and Elizabeth Howard, a noble of illustrious lineage and powerful connections. In the vast tapestry of Tudor society, Anne's birth barely generated a faint ripple. However, from these modest beginnings, something extraordinary was beginning to take root, an existence that would eventually bend the course of English history. From an early age, Anne distinguished herself not by her heritage, but by the sharpness of her intellect. She was perceptive, vivacious, and according to contemporary accounts, possessed a singular magnetism. Recognizing her latent potential, her family sent her to the European continent, where her education truly flourished. First, she served Margaret of Austria in the brilliant court of the Netherlands, an experience few young English women could even dream of. There, Anne absorbed the subtle art of diplomacy, refined her manners, and learned the intricate dance of European politics. But it was in France where Anne's brilliance was polished to its maximum splendor. She spent years in the sophisticated courts of Queen Claude and Queen Margaret of Navarre, becoming familiar with the language of influence, elegance, flirtation, and wit. While other young women perfected their skills in embroidery, Anne mastered conversation, courtly intrigue, and the art of attracting attention without seeming to actively seek it. When she returned to England in the early 1522s, Anne represented a rarity, a woman capable of rivaling the sophistication of the continental courts, while carrying the inherent ambition of a rising English house. She was not a canonical beauty, even her most fervent admirers admitted it, but she possessed an undeniable allure, dark eyes that sparkled with intelligence, a nimble and melodious voice, a way of moving that hinted at a purpose barely veiled under layers of courtly grace. Anne did not just enter rooms, she altered their very atmosphere. In an age where a woman's destiny was often sealed by her lineage and marriage, Anne refused to slip silently into obscurity. She had witnessed the power that charm and intellect could wield in foreign courts, and was determined to employ that knowledge in her homeland. Anne Boleyn was then a young woman, intelligent, ambitious, yet to test her mettle on the grand stages of power, but history was already beginning to stir around her. The girl who returned to England was no longer simply the daughter of Thomas Boleyn. She had become a player in a game of greater proportions, one that would soon engulf the English crown itself. When Anne Boleyn returned to the English court, her presence contrasted sharply with everything the assembled nobility had known until then. In an atmosphere saturated with the delicate pallor and demure manners of English ladies, Anne burst forth like a thunderstorm, unpredictable, magnetic, and impossible to ignore. Her hair as dark as night, her bold eyes, and her quick, sharp wit distinguished her from the gentle, obedient ladies who populated the court of King Henry VIII. Initially, she played the expected role, that of a lady-in-waiting to Queen Catherine of Aragon. But even in the Queen's shadow, Anne's presence flickered with an intensity that defied any attempt at extinction. She danced with exquisite grace, spoke French with the fluency of a native, and laughed with a self-assurance that few women dared to show in public. Men watched her with growing interest, women whispered behind her back, and the court murmured discreetly about the striking Mistress Boleyn. It did not take long for her to attract the most dangerous attention of all, that of the monarch himself. Henry VIII was no stranger to the games of seduction. His court was a playground where whispered promises and furtive encounters were common currency. However, Anne represented a novelty. She did not melt at his gallant compliments, nor eagerly surrender to his arms as so many others had in the past. She provoked him with subtlety, challenged him with intelligence, and sometimes rejected him with unexpected firmness. Henry, a man accustomed to instant adoration and unreserved obedience, found himself completely captivated by this singular woman. The more Anne kept her distance, the more deeply he felt drawn to her. They exchanged letters, filled with declarations of passionate love, palpable frustration, and a growing longing. Henry offered her the role of royal mistress, the unofficial position of greatest influence at court. Anne, astonishingly, declined the offer. She refused to be just another passing conquest, a forgotten lover in the annals of time. If Henry wanted her, he would have to make her his wife. It was a gamble so audacious it left the court stunned. After all, the king was already married. His Queen Catherine was beloved by the people, and fiercely protected by her powerful nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor. The very authority of the Church would have to be challenged for Henry to claim Anne as his own. But Anne did not flinch. She had lived in the courts of Europe, where queens wielded silent but effective power from behind lace fans and enigmatic smiles. She knew that ambition was a dangerous game, but it was a game she was determined to win. Standing tall in the dimly candlelit halls of the English court, Anne Boleyn made a momentous decision, not just to be admired, but to alter her own destiny, and with it, that of all England forever. What began as an intense game of courtship between King Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn soon transformed into a crisis of national proportions. Henry was not just in love, he was obsessed, and in his obsession, he was willing to dismantle everything England had known for centuries. The king's vehement longing to marry Anne collided with an obstacle of considerable magnitude: his previous marriage to Queen Catherine of Aragon. Catherine, invested with dignity and a steely resistance, refused to quietly exit the stage. She had been Henry's faithful wife for 2 decades, and in the eyes of God and the English people, she was the legitimate queen. The mere concept of divorce was not only scandalous but practically unthinkable. But Henry was resolute in his purpose. He convinced himself, and tried to persuade everyone else, that his union with Catherine was cursed by the fact that she had previously been married to his brother, Arthur. It mattered little that the Pope had granted a special dispensation for their marriage years ago. Henry now insisted that his soul was in danger of damnation unless his current marriage was annulled. Anne, for her part, knew it was crucial not to appear too eager. She kept herself just out of his reach, alternating between feeding Henry's hopes and maintaining a studied distance. Every glance, every word was carefully measured. Her ambition was not limited to marriage. She was strategically positioning herself to ascend the throne as Queen of England. The court was plunged into a sea of whispers and the formation of opposing factions. Some noble families eagerly courted Anne's favour, sensing the shift in the winds of power. Others clung vehemently to Queen Catherine, horrified at the prospect of Anne replacing her. Diplomats sent desperate letters to Rome, describing the growing crisis. Foreign monarchs threatened retaliation if the legitimate queen was wronged. Henry's own counsellors shifted uneasily, feeling the ground tremble beneath their feet. As the months turned into years, Henry's frustration intensified. He bombarded the Pope with insistent petitions, manoeuvred his lawyers to find legal loopholes, and slowly began to understand that the Church would not easily yield to his will. Catherine had powerful allies, including her nephew, Emperor Charles V, the most influential man in Europe. Still, Henry persisted in his endeavour, defying prudent advice, ingrained traditions, and increasingly, the established law itself. His courtship of Anne had transcended mere personal desire. It now represented a direct challenge to the very structure of England's political and religious life. Anne was not just capturing the heart of a king, she was dragging an entire kingdom into unexplored and dangerous waters. A high-stakes game had begun, and there was no turning back. After nearly 7 years of agonizing political maneuvering, public scandals, and international diplomatic chaos, Anne Boleyn's audacious gamble finally paid off. In January 1533, she secretly married Henry VIII, an act of defiance considering that technically he was still married to Catherine of Aragon in the eyes of the Pope and much of Europe. In June of the same year, Anne was crowned Queen of England in a lavish ceremony at Westminster Abbey. It should have been the crowning moment of her life, the coronation of her ambitions, but the atmosphere was far from unanimously festive. The people of London watched with weary eyes. Some cheered timidly, others murmured prayers for the dispossessed Queen Catherine. Many wondered if this new queen, with her French manners and bold spirit, represented a blessing or a curse for England. Anne ascended the throne not as a beloved and acclaimed figure, but as the eye of a political storm. Unlike Catherine, who embodied the traditional English values of humility and piety, Anne was dazzling, provocative, and possessed a sharp political cunning. She wore vibrant colours, governed the court with a keen intelligence, and made powerful enemies with astonishing speed. Her position, though seemingly secure, was also terribly precarious. Everything rested on a single crucial factor: providing Henry with a male heir. Anne knew this as well as anyone. She was no longer just the king's mistress. She had become the hope of a new dynasty. At the beginning of her pregnancy, Anne and Henry shared a palpable euphoria, certain the child would be a boy. However, in September 1533, Anne gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth. To her credit, she masked her deep disappointment with grace, insisting that her next child would surely be a son. Henry, in contrast, was less composed. His eyes, once full of adoration, now flickered with a budding doubt. Still, for a time, Anne's star shone brightly. She reshaped the English court in her image, elevating her family to unprecedented heights. and becoming the first queen in English history to be crowned with the sacred oil, an anointing traditionally reserved for male monarchs. Her influence was vast. Foreign ambassadors sought her favour, and European courts rearranged alliances to curry favour with her. The once obedient Henry began to officially distance England from the authority of Rome, creating the Church of England with himself at its head, all to ensure that the legitimacy of Anne's crown could not be questioned. However, even at the height of her triumph, dark clouds were beginning to gather on the horizon. Friends whispered behind her back, rivals lurked in the shadows, awaiting their opportunity, and Henry, volatile and restless by nature, that was already beginning to cast his gaze beyond the brilliant woman who had rewritten his kingdom's destiny for him. Anne had conquered the throne, but keeping it would require much more than charm, ambition, or even love. Anne Boleyn had climbed heights of power unheard of for a woman of her time, but the higher the ascent, the more abrupt and painful the fall. Almost from the moment the crown was placed on her head, the cracks began to spread through the foundations of her world. At the epicenter of her tribulations was the inexorable pressure to produce a male heir. Her firstborn, Elizabeth, though gifted with a precocious intelligence and robust health, was not the son in whom Henry VIII had placed his dynastic ambitions, and time was relentlessly running out. Anne experienced multiple pregnancies in rapid succession, but disappointment followed successive miscarriages that left her physically exhausted and emotionally devastated. Each lost child eroded the foundation upon which she had built her ephemeral reign. Henry, once passionately devoted, began to distance himself, his growing disappointment creating an unbridgeable chasm between them. Anne, never one to suffer in silence, argued vehemently, demanded firmly, fought fiercely to maintain her position. But Henry, a man who valued obedience as much as beauty, grew tired of her sharp intellect, her defiant spirit, the very fire that had once drawn him so strongly. Outside the royal chambers, enemies gathered like wolves in waiting. Numerous nobles who had tolerated Anne's rise with barely disguised resentment now openly conspired to orchestrate her downfall. The staunch supporters of Catherine of Aragon never forgave Anne for what they considered a blatant usurpation and an unforgivable sacrilege. Even the common people murmured against her, labelling her the Great Whore, blaming her for the schism with Rome and the severe transformations that followed. And then Jane Seymour appeared, serene, demure, embodying everything Anne was not. Jane captured Henry's wandering attention, just as Anne's influence began to irreversibly decline. Where Anne had dazzled him with her brilliance and constant challenge, Jane offered a reassuring compliance. It was a dangerous shift, and Anne, perceptive as ever, clearly saw its advent. She desperately tried to regain her position, lavishing attention on Henry, promising future sons, pleading for patience. But the king, ever volatile and inconstant, had already begun to imagine an existence devoid of the woman for whom he had once put an entire kingdom in check. Anne's political enemies, including Thomas Cromwell, who had once been her most influential ally, sensed the changing tide of events. They began to lay the groundwork for a campaign of defamation and destruction, stealthily gathering unfounded accusations, malicious rumours, and pliable witnesses. The woman who had so masterfully played the dangerous game of ambition was now rapidly losing ground. Anne had won her crown with cunning and courage, but in the brutal, shifting universe of Henry's court, past victories were meaningless. Only recent success mattered, and Anne's enemies were sharpening their knives with sinister anticipation. The queen, who had shattered a kingdom, would soon experience how quickly a kingdom could shatter her. Anne Boleyn's adversaries did not charge her with deployed armies, nor with the cold steel of swords. They approached stealthily, armed with insidious whispers, dark secrets, and carefully crafted lies. In the shadowy recesses of the court, a silent, patient, and lethal betrayal was germinating. Thomas Cromwell, who had once been Anne's staunchest ally in the momentous English Reformation, had reversed his loyalty and turned against her. Their initial alliance had been forged on the basis of mutual ambition, but now their irreconcilable interests clashed head-on. Anne longed for reforms that would alleviate the plight of the poor and limit the excessive power of wealth-hungry nobles. Cromwell, on the other hand, sought political stability above all, Henry's unconditional favour, and the absence of any interference in his own designs. Anne's inherent boldness had made her a dangerous figure in the eyes of many, and in Henry's volatile heart, the love he once professed had soured into constant irritation, growing suspicion, and a cold detachment. Anne had few true friends left. Even her personal charm, once her most powerful weapon, now irritated the court's growing thirst for a more docile and malleable queen. And Jane Seymour, silent and calculatingly patient, waited just out of sight, representing the perfect contrast to Anne's fading fire. It was Cromwell who struck the first blow, aware of Henry's growing restlessness. Knowing that the monarch yearned for a way out of his marriage but lacked a convincing excuse, Cromwell devised a grim solution. What if Anne could be removed from the throne not through a divorce, which would deeply humiliate Henry, but through public disgrace and the accusation of heinous crimes? The charges that were fabricated were savage, monstrous even: adultery with several men of the court, sacrilegious incest with her own brother, George Boleyn, and a nefarious conspiracy against the king's life. Anne, the proud and brilliant queen, was painted before the court's eyes as an abject traitor, a dangerous seductress, and a direct threat to the very crown she had once redefined. Cromwell gathered evidence with perverse meticulousness, coercing confessions under the threat of torture and twisting courtly flirtations into damning testimony. Several men of the court, including Anne's own brother, George Boleyn, were arrested and imprisoned. The charges presented lacked logical coherence, were riddled with contradictions and flagrant impossibilities. But in Henry's court, the truth was malleable and adapted to the king's needs. Anne, feeling the noose of intrigue tightening inexorably around her, fought desperately for her life, appealing to the memory of the love she once shared with Henry. But her pleas fell on deaf ears. The man who had once destabilized all of England for her now refused to even look her in the eye. In May 1536, Anne was arrested and taken to the grim Tower of London. When the imposing gate slammed shut behind her, the truth hit her with the force of a hammer blow. She was no longer a queen, but a prisoner, a simple pawn trapped in the brutal game of power she had once played with such mastery. The betrayal, hatched in the shadows, had sealed her fate. And now, alone in her cold tower cell, Anne Boleyn awaited the final move on the relentless board of destiny. Anne Boleyn found herself in the great hall of the Tower of London, facing a tribunal of nobles, many of whom owed their own titles and fortunes to her meteoric rise. Now they sat there, judging her with cold vigilance, prepared to erase from history the woman who had once altered the destiny of England. The charges against her were chilling: adultery with several men of the court, including her own brother, George Boleyn, high treason against the king, and conspiracy to overthrow him. In another context, such accusations against a queen would have been unthinkable. But there, at that fateful moment, they were simply a farce, a grim performance designed to grant Henry VIII exactly what he craved: Anne's downfall. Wrapped in a thin veil of legality, Anne defended herself with the same fire that had once ignited passion in Henry's heart. She denied each accusation with sharp intellect, relentless precision, and an unwavering composure that astonished even her staunchest enemies. She reminded them that she had been crowned with sacred oil, chosen by divine grace, and anointed as Queen of England. She evoked her unwavering loyalty, her personal sacrifices, and the love she once professed, but it was all in vain. The verdict had already been decided long before Anne set foot in the courtroom. The trial was a mere spectacle for the court and for the people, a public and humiliating destruction of a woman who had once shown herself to be indomitable. Witness after witness, many of them coerced or bribed, uttered condemning words. The dates and places of the alleged crimes flagrantly contradicted each other. The evidence was flimsy when it existed, but the truth had become irrelevant. Anne was found guilty. Her brother George and the other men accused alongside her were also sentenced to death. Anne would be executed by beheading, a relatively merciful sentence compared to the usual death reserved for traitors: hanging, drawing, and quartering. When the verdict was read, Anne did not break. She stood tall, her face pale, but her spirit fiercely intact. In those last moments, before being led back to her cell, she spoke clearly, declaring she was prepared to die and begging God to have mercy on her soul. When the heavy doors of the hall closed behind her, the court exhaled a collective sigh of relief. The storm that had been Anne, brilliant, dangerous, and unforgettable, had almost come to an end. But even then, they did not fully understand. By erasing her from the face of the earth, they were not annihilating Anne Boleyn, but immortalizing her in betrayal, in tragedy, and in enduring legend. After her summary trial, Anne Boleyn was returned to the Tower of London, not as the triumphant queen who had once ruled England with a firm hand, but as a prisoner condemned to death, awaiting her inescapable fate. However, even facing the imminent end, Anne refused to collapse in the face of adversity. In the cold, echoing corridors of the tower, Anne prepared for her final transit. She spent countless hours in prayer, kneeling on the hard stone floors, her hands clasped tightly, her voice firm and serene. She confessed to no crime, for in her heart she held the conviction of her innocence. She did not fear death, she affirmed with fortitude, but she raised her prayers that her sacrifice would bring peace to the kingdom and perhaps mercy for her little daughter, Elizabeth. Her ladies-in-waiting, the few who had remained loyal despite the storm, wept in private for her misfortune. Anne, with admirable strength, comforted them, instead of seeking comfort from them. At times, she even allowed a somber humour to peek through her words, joking bitterly that she would be remembered as a queen who had lost her head. In that dark humour persisted the indomitable spark that had made her unforgettable. Henry VIII, meanwhile, showed not the slightest hint of clemency. He had already turned his volatile attention to Jane Seymour, even before the fateful date for Anne's execution was set. Henry was diligently preparing for his next marriage, anxious to ensure the continuity of his male lineage. For Anne, this final betrayal from the man who had once put an entire kingdom in check for her must have represented the deepest and most painful cut. On the 18th of May, 1536, Anne was informed that she would die at dawn the next day. She slept little that night. Instead, she dedicated her last earthly hours to prayer, imploring divine forgiveness for all those who had wronged her, and perhaps also for herself, for the ambition and pride that had led her to this tragic end. Henry, in a rare gesture of royal kindness, had arranged for a French swordsman to carry out the execution, a quicker, cleaner, and less brutal method than the common axe. It was a small mercy, purchased perhaps more by the king's conscience than for Anne's comfort. At dawn, Anne dressed carefully for her final act, a dark grey damask dress adorned with fur, with a crimson kirtle underneath, colours that evoked dignity and sacrifice. She gathered her dark hair and secured it under a simple coif, preparing to face the blade with grace and fortitude. As the cold morning fog of the tower swirled around the ancient stones of the courtyard, Anne Boleyn, queen, mother, survivor, fighter, stepped forward toward her destiny. There would be no tears, no desperate pleas, only a final act of bravery in the face of history's relentless judgment. Her end was near, but her story was just beginning to resonate through the centuries. On the morning of the 19th of May, 1536, Anne Boleyn ascended the makeshift scaffold within the grim walls of the Tower of London. A small crowd gathered in silence. Intrigued courtiers, stoic guards, a few curious onlookers, all wrapped in a sepulchral silence, as if even the cold stones of the tower were holding their breath before the impending drama. Anne stood tall, her grey dress fluttering slightly in the chilly morning breeze. She looked thinner than in her court days, her face pale but serene. There was no hysteria, no heart-wrenching sobs. If anything, she faced death with the same fierce dignity that had once shaken a kingdom to its foundations. She spoke briefly, carefully, choosing her last words with precision. She accused no one. She did not defend herself against the charges. She offered a prayer for the health and prosperity of the king, the very man who had abandoned her in her final moments. Anne offered the world not a confession of guilt, but an act of transcendent forgiveness. Her silent bravery amazed even those who had come to witness her fall. The French executioner, brought specially to ensure a swift, painless death, advanced with a steady step. Anne knelt upright, her hands clasped in a final gesture of prayer, her eyes lifted to the sky. A small white cloth covered her gaze. She remained motionless in a surprising peace. The sword flashed once, silent, swift, and Anne Boleyn, queen, mother, architect of history, ceased to exist on the earthly plane. She was buried hastily in an unmarked grave within the tower grounds, placed in an arrow chest for lack of a coffin befitting her rank. A queen once crowned with gold now disappeared without earthly ceremony. However, Anne's story did not conclude in that cold, nameless grave. Her daughter, Elizabeth, the child whose birth had once disappointed a king greedy for male heirs, would rise to become one of the most momentous monarchs in English history. Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, whose reign would witness the flourishing of the arts, the rise of English power, and its global influence. A queen who inherited her mother's indomitable spirit, sharp mind, and unbreakable resistance. Anne Boleyn altered the course of England forever. Her ambition helped trigger the break with Rome and the birth of the Anglican Church. Her abrupt fall showed the world that even queens could be mercilessly discarded. However, through her lineage, through Elizabeth, Anne's legacy shone with a greater intensity than any earthly crown she had worn in life. In the end, Anne Boleyn conquered a form of immortality, not through physical survival, but through her indelible impact on the course of history. And so, as the mists of time dissipate, the story of Anne Boleyn resonates, not as a truncated fairy tale, but as a powerful reminder of the ambition, courage, and indelible legacy that a single life can leave on the tapestry of history. Her dream of reigning, though ephemeral, ignited a spark that transformed a nation, and whose echo we can still hear in the whispers of the wind through the centuries. May her story accompany you in the silence of the night. See you in the next video.